Okay, welcome everyone joining us online. I hope you can all hear us okay, see us okay. Delighted to welcome you all. For those of you here in person at the Blavatnik school, thank you for keeping up the great energy. It feels like it's been an intellectual marathon the last couple of days. It is a Friday afternoon here in the UK. I completely didn't realize it's Friday afternoon. Andy, one of our guest speakers today, was saying on LinkedIn earlier actually that he looks forward to having his brain stretched this afternoon. That's exactly what we're going to do. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrea. I'm head of partnerships and engagements at the Government Outcomes Lab. It's my absolute pleasure to be hosting this really important discussion. We're asking a really big question that I know many of you have been asking for years, if not decades. And I'm joined by an absolutely spectacular panel this afternoon. We were due to be joined by a representative from the UK government as well. Unfortunately, due to the sad news we had last night, protocol says that civil servants cannot do any public appearances at the moment. So we're very sad we can't have Val Keane with us on the panel. I'll briefly introduce our lovely panelists, but just very briefly, I could feel the whole session talking about their achievements. But as I said, we have a big topic, so let's get started. So Congressman McAdams, could I come to you first? Thank you for joining us from the US. Could I just get you to maybe just say a few words about your work, just to also make sure that we can hear you okay here at the Blavatnik School?
Thank you. Yeah, great to be with you all. Thank you so much for this invitation to join you. I wish I could be there in person, but it's wonderful that I can join you remotely today. So my name is Ben McAdams. I most recently served in the United States Congress. Previous to that, I was the mayor of Salt Lake County, and in that role led some of the work here in the U.S. to advance social impact bonds. We did the first social impact bond focused on early childhood education, and then also more recently did social impact bonds on reducing recidivism and homelessness with a randomized control trial to assess the impact of our assessments. And we have learned so much throughout this process. And it's wonderful to be with you today to talk about what we are learning collectively.
Delighted to have you with us. So moving on now to our panelists here in the room. Next to me, I have Louise Saville. I think most of you know her. She's actually just came off another session. We've been making her work very hard at this year's conference. So Louise is Director of Social Finance. Louise, do you want to say a few words about the work that you do?
Sure, my name's Louise Saville. I'm co-founder and director at Social Finance. I jointly lead our international team with a particular focus on work in lower middle income countries. I'm also very privileged to be a visiting fellow of practice here at the Blavatnik School of Government, where I get to work very closely with Andrea and her colleagues, which is a huge privilege. So it's great to be here today.
Thanks, Louise. And in fact, we have quite a few of our fellows of practice joining us on this panel and also at the conference more generally. So on to another fellow of practice, Tom Kenyon, who, when he's not busy being a fellow of practice, he's a senior economist at the World Bank.
Thanks very much. Yes, I work in the operations policy department of the World Bank. I'm responsible for overseeing one of our financing instruments, a results-based financing instrument, which accounts for about 20% of overall World Bank lending. About 8 billion in commitments per year. Before I joined this team, I worked on and designed operations in Brazil and South Africa, among other places. Very nice to be here. I'm actually a native of Oxford, so I feel very much at home.
Well, great to have you here. Avnish, can I come to you next? It's a pleasure to have you. You've traveled all the way from Colombia to be with us at the conference. We're very humbled and grateful for that.
Thank you. Nice to see everybody. So my name is Avnish Gangadharas. I'm the managing partner and co-founder of Instiglio. Instiglio advances results-based financing practices, trying to mainstream them in government practices in low middle income countries, mostly in Latin America and Africa.
Wonderful.
Also a visiting fellow of practice at the GoLab.
Thank you. And from a visiting fellow of practice, moving on to a visiting professor. So we're always keen to have alongside practitioners, academic perspectives. Caroline, it's such an honor to have you on the panel. Welcome. And again, I think a lot of people know you, but it'd be great, especially for those of us to hear a few words about you.
So I'm a professor of public policy education economics at Vanderbilt University, and actually here for the year as a George Eastman professor at Oxford. And I've been studying performance-based contracting and outcomes-based contracting for about 3 decades in my career. And so I'm going to bring a little bit of the academic experience, but also do a lot of work with governments at all levels and in the gritty details of implementation.
Wonderful. Thanks, Caroline. And last but certainly not least, we've got Andy Brown joining us, a rare type of participant for our conference. He does not work on social outcome contracts. He does not work on social impact bonds, but we've invited him on the panel, particularly because we want to make sure we're not just focusing on this one mechanism when we're talking about outcome-focused partnerships. And Andy, please tell us a bit more about what you do.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Andy Brown. I'm the head of sustainability for Anglian Water Group, and yes, a visiting fellow of practice. And although I don't work on social outcome bonds, our company, our entire capital program, so that all the infrastructure that we build is actually financed through climate bonds, green bonds, biodiversity bonds, and we're talking about, you know, the potential for social outcome bonds as well. So I work closely with our board, but part of my work is about looking outside of our operational business and developing partnerships to deliver, well, I guess what you would call social outcomes across the east of England.
Wonderful. And so we've met all of our guest speakers. Please, can I invite everyone in the room or everyone online to also introduce themselves in the Zoom chat if you're on Zoom. I know it's the last session of the day, but we want to make sure it's going to feel just as interactive and dynamic as all the other sessions we've had at the conference. So we actually heard yesterday from Professor Julie Batiana about how we might gain power for social change. And I think whether you agree with Julie's arguments or not, I think we can all agree that in one way or another, all of us here are trying to achieve some sort of social change. So again, just borrowing Julie's framework, whether you're an orchestrator, an agitator, or innovator, I feel like everyone here in one way or another is trying to make change happen, but not just happen, but also stick. So that's the big question that we're looking at today. And we're very much looking at it from this prism of outcomes-based partnerships. And we are, of course, based at the Blavatnik School of Government, and we care so deeply and so profoundly about how to improve government and how to improve the systems within which government can deliver social services, public service provision. So obviously in our work, we spend a lot of our attention on social outcome contract. We talk to a lot of practitioners, a lot of policymakers. And one of the things that keeps coming up in our conversations is how it seems anecdotally that there's something special about these instruments. And a lot of people who've worked directly on these projects will often say that beyond the immediate impact or the outcomes that such projects set out to achieve, there's almost a spillover effect, which could, take lots of different shapes and forms, a kind of wider systemic institutional impact. So we're hearing this anecdotally, we're very intrigued, but we're also intrigued to challenge perhaps practitioners a little bit and ask kind of what is the evidence? And whilst we've been talking about it for quite a while, I think there's not that much that has been systematically gathered to try to make progress with these questions. And indeed, this morning at one of the sessions, we were talking about the Life Chances Fund projects in the UK and sustainability questions for those projects. And I know there were a couple of questions, and we touched upon these questions around the wider systemic impacts or benefits of working in this way. So these are some of the questions we're hoping to explore today. So we want to do 3 things to kind of bring some order to this discussion. So reflect on some of the, I guess, practical examples, best practice to date. We'll hear from Ben. I know Louise in one of the papers that she's very recently published also discusses some case studies. So we want to look at kind of what are the, I think, Louise, you call this engines of impact. So what's different in an impact bond or a social outcome contract that might be conducive to kind of wider benefits. We want to discuss that, but we also want to discuss the wider system within which these tools exist. So what are the factors that influence how these engines of impact work? And again, Andy, will come to you. It'd be great to hear from your work what those engines of impact look like are these things really unique to impact bonds or social outcome contracts, or actually there are lots of other types of partnerships whereby we could be achieving similar impacts? So without further ado, I'll hand over to our speakers. And Avnish, I would like to come to you first, because you're actually the one who challenged us to have this discussion out in the open and convene this panel. So you've been very much the inspiration for having this discussion. Why should we be talking about this, and why now?
Thanks, Andrea, for this stage setting. So what I wanted to maybe kick us off with to set the stage as well is talking a little bit about stock taking. Where are we with 10 years for some of us more in this journey? And it's useful to ask ourselves, why are we talking about mainstreaming and scaling, and how should we talk about it? What's the urgency around that, right? And I'll talk obviously from the perspective of low middle income countries, but I suppose some of these insights can also be applicable to the UK and elsewhere. So when we think about the urgency and why we need to really focus on mainstreaming results-based approaches in general in governments, I always start with kind of just sizing the challenge, right? And when you think about low middle income countries, on a yearly basis, it's about $5 trillion of spending going through government systems. That's through procurement systems or direct service delivery systems. You think of your education systems, your health systems, and so on and so forth. So if you think about the sustainable development goals that we've set for ourselves in the 2030 timeframe, we're really talking about this is the largest engine of impact that we have available, government systems that deliver services. Now, how are these systems doing so far? Recently, the World Bank actually did a study of education systems in 31 countries, and they found that about 48% of that spending had zero correlation with learning outcomes. And those anecdotal evidence are replicated across sectors, across geographies. In some countries, we did a triangulation, and we would think that the effectiveness of service delivery systems in government is potentially below 20% of their full potential. So you're talking about like deep failures in making the main sort of source of service delivery systems actually impact lives at the front lines of service delivery. And that evidence is, paints a bit of a picture of the snapshot, but then you kind of ask yourself, are we at least on the right trajectory? Are we going to get there in our lifetime, in the right sort of time frame? And in 2017, there was a study in Harvard that always kind of marked my imagination a little bit. And they looked at service delivery systems across 112 countries, across the board, and tried to ask themselves, how long on this trajectory would it take for these systems to actually be reliable in delivering public services of decent quality, such that kids get educated, healthcare outcomes are being achieved in clinics, and so on. And they found that 89 out of the 112 countries would not have the systems required by the end of this century. So we will all not be here anymore by then, probably, So in our lifetime, we don't have our main engine of impact ready for having impact. And I think if this is shocking, it's an understatement, an underestimation of how big the problem is, because this is just an estimation of how long it's going to take to deliver the services as we know them today. But the world is becoming a more complex place, and the kind of services that governments are having to deliver to citizens are increasing in complexity as well. So you have this exponential increase in complexity of the mandate of government, yet they're not able to progress even in a minor linear way over time. So I think we're running towards a big challenge for governments really failing to deliver on the mandates. And if we want to see things like, things we talk about, like in the well-being dashboard being properly addressed in terms of, mental health, in terms of education, educating the future generations of kids, we can't really work around this problem. We have to go at it. And that's what gets me excited about this community, because we're really focusing on this thorny issue of how do we get governments to be delivering better. So my call to action really to the community is, we've been, I think, in a cycle of experimentation, innovation in so many different places. We've done the impact bond work. We've hooked many government agencies to start wanting to pay for results and really go towards an outcomes-oriented world. What is the pathway? What's our theory of change of how this is going to scale within systems of government to a place where you might be able to see ministries of finance having public financial systems that actually are conditioning public disbursements to value creation, or auditing agencies thinking that their roles is not just to make sure that public funds have not been, going to the wrong use, but actually have generated value as well. So we really need to ask, from wherever we stand, I think, what is the mainstreaming pathway, and focus and obsess on this and really go from innovation to mainstream rather quickly, and time is against us in many ways, I would say, right? So really kind of that's the challenge, is how do we move the conversation, the intention, and the actions towards mainstreaming activities? Thank you.
That's very daunting picture you've painted for us. Louise, where do social outcome contracts come into that? Don't have to answer straight away. As I've mentioned, you've recently published a paper on social outcome contracts and system strengthening, and I invite all of you to read the full paper. It's available on the GoLab website. But we've invited Louise to share with us some highlights from the paper. So Louise, please take it away, and we've got some slides ready as well.
Thank you so much for inviting me to present, I guess, a conceptual framework for the discussion today. I'll try and keep it short, but I think it's also useful to have this as a context for today's discussion. So this question of how time-bound, tightly defined social outcomes contracts fit within and could support broader and longer-term capacity or system-building efforts is really one of critical importance. It's also one, as Avnish has said, that as a practitioner in this space is really what drives me to get out of bed in the morning, and has done for the last 15 years, I guess, of working in this space. And of course, we want to ensure that every program we design and support creates the best possible outcomes for the populations they're designed to serve. But more than that, we want to change the basis of accountability for public spending, a basis that is grounded in outcomes for the service users, for the people receiving the services, and not just for those services that are delivered under the auspices of a social impact bond or an outcomes contract, but for all services, a much broader set of public services. And I think I also would love to see these contracts catalyzing a new way of thinking about service delivery that sees change and adaptation as success rather than failure. Ooh. Juliana, thank you. So, Caroline, I'm going to embarrass you by quoting you, but fundamentally, as my colleague and fellow panelist today, Caroline Heinrich, said in her keynote address to this conference in 2018, increasing public-private capacities for more effectively serving vulnerable populations and holding programs accountable politically and contractually for longer-term outcomes and impacts. If we can achieve that, we as a community can achieve that, it will be a major public management contribution. And that's sort of what we're here to talk about today. These conversations about whether and how social outcomes contracts might support broader system strengthening have been increasingly taking place among practitioners. But as Andrea has said, actually, not much has been written about this to date. And so it's been a huge privilege over the last year, really since last year's conference, to have had the opportunity to work with colleagues at GoLab and many of you in the sector to identify both the key drivers of impact within social outcomes contracts, and then to think about how those drivers of impact might influence broader, longer-term system strengthening. We've also, though, reflected beyond social outcomes contracts and thought about what can we learn from results-based finance more broadly, and what can we learn from the decades of development programming around how governments learn and under what context this kind of change takes place. So as Andrea mentioned, this thinking is now available as a working paper, so for discussion and contention. But we very much hope that what I'm going to present today will help to crystallize some of this thinking into a framework that's helpful to researchers and evaluators, but also to practitioners and governments. So let's look at some of those drivers of resilience and impact in social outcomes contracting. So we first note that social outcomes contracts are differentiated from other forms of results-based finance by the shift in accountability to service user outcomes rather than service provider activities. And this shift, as we've discussed extensively over the last 2 days, enables scope for greater operational flexibility, driven by a focus on continuous learning and adaptation, and underpinned by real-time data. Now, building on insights from over 85 impact-born practitioners during COVID and some work that actually Mara, the director of the GoLab, and I did back in 2020 to analyze those conversations, the paper proposes 3 core engines of impact, as Andrea described. The first is cross-sector alignment. So, centering activities around a shared definition of success, bringing partners together from multiple sectors around that definition of success, and then substantiating and reinforcing that alignment through payments and financial incentives. The second driver is then outcomes-focused delivery, so real-time data collection, creating a culture of continuous learning and adaptation, and then partnering that with contracts that allow the flexibility to adapt and to innovate. And the third piece, equally, if not most important, is engaged government, shifting the basis of accountability for public programs towards accountability for outcomes, and creating a culture of shared decision-making and rapid course correction. So while these characteristics underpin the contracts themselves, I think they also can help us in thinking through how these contracts might conceivably influence system strengthening more broadly. So let's remind ourselves what we're thinking about here. We're talking today about change that sticks beyond the duration of any given social outcomes contract, and also beyond the scope of any given outcomes contract. And as I outline in my paper, I think there are 2 primary pathways through which system strengthening could occur, neither of which is guaranteed, neither of which are exclusive to social outcomes contracts, and they're not mutually exclusive either, but it's clear that one may take precedence over the other in any given context. So pathway 1 speaks to the potential impact of social outcomes contracts on improving broader policy and service design. This pathway reflects the stated intention of many social outcomes contracts to not only deliver better social outcomes for service users within the term of the contract, but also through adaptive learning, outcomes-focused delivery, and sharing those learnings to inform broader policy and service design for particular populations for future delivery at scale. And an example of that might be, for instance, the recently completed Cameroon Kangaroo Mother Care Development Impact Bond, where as a result of a social outcomes contract that ran for 3 years, KMC is now being embedded into national neonatal policies, complete with training for clinicians, ongoing data collection, and financial incentives through the World Bank's mainstream performance-based financing structures. So that's a clear example of how policy and intervention might spread beyond a social outcomes contract. Pathway 2 then speaks to the sort of intangible, less sexy behind the scenes stuff. So it speaks to the potential of social outcomes contracts to influence and improve policy implementation practices more broadly, to shift commissioning, contracting, contract management, service delivery practices, particularly those related to the outcomes-focused delivery, cross-sector governance, cross-sector partnership and outcomes-focused governance that we described before. And I'm really excited to have Congressman McAdams with us on the panel today, who can speak, I think, a bit later to how social outcomes contracts in Utah have catalyzed the creation of both new data sets and a whole new set of conversations among the state legislature there. However, it would be remiss of me to conclude this presentation without noting the importance of contextual considerations on the likely system strengthening impact of social outcomes contracts. Indeed, we know from decades of mainstream RBF evaluations that if badly implemented without sufficient consideration of existing systems, structures, and incentives, it's conceivable that social outcomes contracts could actually weaken existing systems in some contexts rather than strengthen them. I think it's also important to recognise that we already know quite a lot about how and when governments learn. And the 3 factors on this slide are not intended to be comprehensive in any way, but speak to some of the major determinants, I guess, that influence whether and how change sticks. So we know that the nature of the political system and the way that decisions are made can have a big impact on both the extent of change and also the timescales for that change. We know that the basis on which politicians, civil servants, and other stakeholders are rewarded and incentivized, whether that's really based on outcomes or whether it's based on applying processes that are defined from the top, can have a big impact on their willingness to adopt and use change. And there are other important considerations too, like leadership from the top and attention to informal relational dynamics, the stuff that Julie Battiliano was describing yesterday in her keynote speech. Really important to understand who stands to benefit and who stands to lose from any changes. So I guess in my mind, this speaks to the potential of social outcomes contracts, in my mind, are like a tugboat. Government policy and processes are slow to change. They're like an oil tanker. Social outcomes contracts potentially are nimble. We can turn around quickly, we can learn, we can communicate those learnings. And while it's a labor-intensive process to change the direction of an oil tanker, clearly once you've shifted it, that's a lot of power moving in a different direction. So just to conclude, I guess, my primary reflection, and Avnish is right, I've been doing this now for 15 years, I think, is not to underestimate the power of pilots, of standalone programs, of sort of islands of effectiveness to influence broader social change. That can happen. And not to make the best the enemy of the good. Not to just assume that because we can't get from A to Z today, the shift from A to C isn't worthwhile. But actually, over time, cumulative improvements, cumulative change can really create significant impact. So that's me. There's a contextual framework, and I'm very much looking forward to participating in the discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Louise. Thanks for sharing that. Caroline, I'll come to you in a second, but I just wanted to check whether there are any questions, any clarification points for Louise. No, doesn't look like it. Brilliant. So, Caroline, we've obviously been talking about the evolving narratives around social impact bonds, the promises associated with impact bonds, ever since you delivered that wonderful keynote, but actually probably before that. And I know you were asking at the time, are CIPs the emperor's new clothes? Have we made any progress since 2018? Where are we now? And where's the academic thinking, I guess, and evidence?
Sure. Well, I think it's helpful, I've actually talked a little bit about cycles of experimentation, innovation, and there was a little bit, I think, of kind of concern and about why we haven't made more progress. Why are we still working so hard on that, on some of the same issues? But if you look back at both writings in academic circles and politicians, I mean, these ideas that we have to figure out how the public sector and private sector work together more effectively go back to the 1800s. You can find it in published work by Woodrow Wilson and others. And we've been experimenting, I would say, with outcomes-based contracting and performance-based contract efforts since at least the 1970s. And there is a book written by a scholar, and it was called by Paul Light, called "The Tides of Reform." And I think it's really helpful to think about it. We will see these same ideas and feel these urgencies for reform come and go. Right, and come and go again in slightly different, we are evolving. So I think the encouraging thing is, yes, we've been talking about these ideas for a long time. We've tried many different things. You can think about the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher was talking about value for money, and Ronald Reagan started in the United States having actual performance-based contracting for our basic, some of our core public service programs. But I do think it's important that we recognize that there is increasing complexity in our governance mechanisms. So we have evolved in thinking about how we, for example, measure outcomes. We've realized from early work that if we don't carefully choose our outcomes, that we're taking the time to align the goals of various partners and programs and people who are affected, and we can have perversion of those performance measures. They can be gamed. So we've learned about that over time. And so some of those learnings actually end up coming back into the new formulations. So for example, some of the promise of social impact bonds was that we recognized that we have to think longer term, right? One of the things we learned from the scientific studies and literature on this was that short-term outcomes could be more easily gained, and that oftentimes what we measured as a positive impact in a short time was not correlated well with long-term impacts. So like the greatest example I had from my own research was that, if we got people in employment services placed quickly into jobs, we could quickly count, their weight. Now they have wages again, and they're no longer employed. But if we didn't make those placements with considering good matches between their skills, or maybe building up their skills so that they could do better, they might lose that job within 6 months. And then we're back to the start again versus finding out ways to incentivize impact. So one of the interesting things about social impact bonds is really thinking longer term and about how we would move towards impacts and away from just thinking about the shorter term. We've encountered some of the same challenges today that we've faced in the past. For example, but I've also seen progress. So data, right? One of the encouraging things I've heard in a lot of discussions about SIBs is bringing people to the table and starting to get people to share data, and people in various sectors and different roles who are participating in SIBs to think about how we can effectively use that data. Another important evolution from past outcomes-based mechanisms and ways we've done that in the public sector contracting is to recognize that having performance outcomes or standards that we're tracking for the purposes of penalizing or holding people accountable in terms of consequences, sanctions, or naming and shaming. There are examples from the National Health Service here in the UK where that was part of the initial thing. We realized that it's not a very effective way to get people to buy in to share and use data. The fact that you have to worry it could be used against you, or that it could derail collaborations and relational aspects of contracting that we've come to learn are very important. So I feel like even though it can seem like we are still mired in really big challenges, right? We're still trying to figure out, what are the best designs for these things. When the other encouraging things, just being here at this conference and seeing and look at the amazing data that have been shared and organized and used in really effective ways to enlighten us about what is working well, what is not working well, how can we learn from even specific cases. And so I see a tremendous amount of progress. We face, there are probably inherent challenges. It was also mentioned in how our governing systems operate, right? We often are oriented towards showing progress in the short term, demonstrating results as quickly as possible. And that again can be at odds with these longer term goals. So I think this is I encourage a positive light on this discussion in which we're reflecting on these issues.
Thank you, Caroline. That's a great way to frame the rest of our discussion. So let's dig a bit deeper into these questions of the levers of impact, mechanisms of impact. And Congressman McAdams, I'd like to come to you next. Louise, in her presentation, mentioned the work you led in Utah on a number of Pay for Success programs. How did you shift the tanker in Utah?
Yeah, thank you. So my first experience with Pay for Success came when some community leaders, including myself, I was the mayor of Salt Lake County at the time, and we were working with the United Way, and we were trying to advance some investments in early childhood education. And our state legislature was actually resistant to the idea of investing and creating yet another, what they would say, yet another government program, wasting taxpayer dollars investing in early childhood education. And we wanted to show that actually this mattered. That and the cost avoidance potential of investing in early childhood education meant we could save money down the road. And the thesis, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but if we can give a child a positive, strong start on life, we will avoid certain costs in a few short years. The first one being investments in special education for youth, children who are behind in their learning, and we have to invest extra tax dollars to help them to catch up. The data shows that they rarely catch up. They're at a high risk of dropping out of a lot of adverse outcomes like teenage pregnancy, dropout, and criminal justice involvement, juvenile justice involvement. And our thesis was that by investing in early childhood education, we could break these and avoid these other outcomes. So in the absence of the state legislature willing to invest in this, I invested some of our Salt Lake County dollars into this program to get it started. And it was the first social impact bond focused on early education. What we saw was indeed the outcomes were astounding, that in simply investing in the education of 3- and 4-year-olds, we were avoiding outcomes just 2 years later in special education. And so such a resounding success that we saw a mindset change in state leaders here in the state of Utah. So today, the state of Utah, state government invests in early childhood education. They set up the early childhood education quality improvement program, and they're investing millions in state dollars, an order of magnitude greater than what we were doing with our social impact bond, just investing directly. So the first outcome that we saw was an incredible mindset change. And I think that's part of the what we can see happen with investing in social impact bonds. If I can speak real quickly about the other one that we did, following on this experience, I also wanted to change the norm around criminal justice and how we engage with addiction. And we know we can't incarcerate our way out of addiction. In fact, oftentimes by coming in and incarcerating, we make the problem worse. We take somebody who's got an addiction and we connect them to a community that's going to exacerbate the problem. And we knew that we could actually probably save money if we invested in an ounce of prevention, if we invested in getting somebody out of the criminal justice system and housed, getting them employed, getting them the wraparound services that they're going to need to be successful. And so we launched 2 SIBs about around that time. It would have been in 2017, because as we started looking at this, we recognized that the populations we were looking at were different. They had different underlying causes. You can't just put all homeless people in a broad category of needing one type of prescription. They need, we identified different characteristics that we felt warranted breaking it into 2 different types of initiatives. And so we launched that initiative. And soon after we launched the initiative in 2018, well, a couple of big things happened. I was elected to Congress, so I stepped out, which I think is a note. Elected officials are often changing over. But what happened with the social impact bond approach is we had continuity. We had made a long-term investment that wasn't dependent upon the whims of any particular elected official, but this program was set up to go for at least the 5 years of the social impact bond. The second major thing happened was in 2020, and that was COVID hit and isolation and shutdowns. And at the same time, we were facing an affordable housing crisis. So where our outcomes were getting people in treatment and keeping them in treatment and getting them housed, and 2 fundamental principles of this intervention were eroded. Our treatment programs were shut down and there was no availability of housing. So one of the things that we saw that was incredibly helpful is the resiliency because of the SIB. The funding, if this had just been a government appropriation, I think what we would have been inclined to do is to say, well, incredibly challenging circumstances, we will continue to pay and forget about the measuring the outcomes. We're just going to pay for this. That wasn't how it was structured. The liability, the responsibility for performing an outcome had been placed on the providers because of the social impact bond, and they knew they had to be resilient. So they rallied. They brought together other actors who were aligned in the space. They identified housing. They identified ways to get people back into treatment, how they could continue the treatment services in light of COVID, and the programs continued, and the programs were resilient and successful. So we've seen systems change, resiliency. The other thing that I would add is we realized we didn't have a data system to actually track the outcomes like we wanted to. So we saw these providers investing and creating the data systems they would need to be able to track the outcomes. So it completely transformed our system. We're just coming up on the conclusion of that those 2 social impact bonds. So we don't have the actual data right now, but we can see from peeking behind the curtain that these programs have been astoundingly successful compared to our baseline programs that we're also seeking to have similar outcomes.
Thank you. Thanks for that. It's great to have that lived example, and what an inspiring example. So moving from the state level and a high income country, I'd like to turn our attention to the perhaps like international context and thinking specifically about low and middle income countries. I expect things get a bit more complicated in some of those contexts. Tom, you should know, so can I come to you next?
Sure, thanks very much. I want to make three skeptical points about this relationship between system strengthening and outcomes-based contracting. The first point is that they're not the same thing. They can be complementary in the sense that you probably want to focus attention on meaningful results and you want to make sure they're sustainable, but they don't always go together. We have one financing instrument which does both. It disperses about 60% against system strengthening, 40% against results. But we also have a results-based financing instrument that uses our own systems for procurement and financial management and social and environmental risk management, and doesn't even make a claim to be strengthening local systems. Bear in mind also that there's been decades of work on things like procurement systems, on anti-corruption, on aspects of governance, which has had nothing to do with results-based financing, and which has been driven by concerns over fiduciary compliance. And it would be tough to say that it hasn't been at least somewhat effective. The second point I want to make is that the aspects of systems that we're talking about are difficult to improve and politically sensitive. Generally, when we talk about service delivery, the things that matter behind the scenes are things like budgeting, funds flow from ministries of finance to sector agencies, and from there on to service providers, procurement, and to some degree monitoring and evaluation. It took about 200 years or more to get sound budgetary institutions in Western European countries. They're still evolving or regressing in some cases. And it's not realistic to suppose that we're going to achieve anything like that level of results in over one or two project cycles. Attempts to strengthen these systems can also run into and threaten political bargains that might have been made. The introduction of financial management systems, for instance, threatens discretionary budget allocations, makes it very hard for people to change course during the fiscal year. The introduction of external monitoring and assessment of results can invalidate and threaten achievements that people may have valued, including those sometimes financed by external donors. Attempts to reform HR systems or civil service systems can threaten existing entitlements or former performance incentives that have hardened, ossified into entitlements. It's often very hard to get adequate data on unit costs from procurement processes from government. This is very sensitive, so difficult to analyze. That said, and this is the third point, I think there is a potential theory linking results-based finance, outcomes-based contracting to system strengthening, though I don't see a lot of evidence for it yet. The theory is that dispersing against results, and when I say results, I mean not just service delivery outcomes, but I mean measurable improvements in the systems that underpin those outcomes, things like rates of budget execution, delays in funds flow, the timeliness, fairness, transparency of the procurement process, the reliability, timeliness of information flows within government. Attaching money to those through disbursements can be a powerful incentive to improve them. And it also guards against the tendency that a lot of development projects have to reward what effective governments look like, not what they do. To reward not just the acquisition of IT systems, but their effective use and deployment by line ministries. That said, I think the evidence for this actually occurring in practice is pretty thin. We've just done a review of 10 years of program for results financing. It's about 80, 100 operations. There are some aspects of the instrument that predispose it to system strengthening. You do see improvements in the reliability of program data on program outcomes. You see line ministries and ministries of finance being forced to collaborate and actually thrash out in budget discussions what they're going to receive each year, and then you can ensure that you see that the funds flow more adequately. But there's not much evidence of the sort of adaptive management that we sometimes think of as being associated with outcomes-based contracting. Often governments see this as a mechanism for forcing top-down accountability. They don't see it as a means of decentralizing problem solving to frontline service providers. And there's almost no evidence that I've seen of spillovers beyond program boundaries, at least not for the operations we've looked at. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. I think, yes, it's very important to remind ourselves to challenge some of the claims we keep making or demand strong evidence for them. Andy, I'd like to come to you now. How does this all resonate from your perspective? You work extensively with lots of different stakeholders, both in government, lots of community group, local businesses. What does success look like for you in that context? What does system strengthening mean for you?
Thank you. And yeah, just again to say, one of the reasons that I'm involved with GoLab was to bring, I guess, a slightly different perspective from the outside. So, in terms of if you only look at what the really good social outcome bonds deliver, if you're only looking at social outcome bonds, you don't see other social outcomes being delivered in other forms. So, I'll just explain, I guess, a little bit about the water industry, because when I read Louise's paper, it was really interesting to see the synergies between what you were discussing in there and where the regulatory framework of the industry was moving and has moved. So I'll mention a little bit about, I guess, what that are, the paid for success elements of that. But then again, looking beyond that, there's a huge amount of work going on out there which is kind of not paid for, success which is not paid for. And I was in a session earlier on with Harry looking at environmental outcomes, and there were the same opportunities there. There are lots of environmental outcomes that are being driven by the private sector which really aren't drawn in. And there's a real opportunity to cross the divide in both spaces, to learn from each other, to try and drive more collaborative success. So as an industry, water companies in the UK are funded on a 5-year cycle. So we take information from the environmental quality regulators and from customers, and we build a plan, and that plan goes to our financial regulator, and the financial regulator, through discussion, decides what should go in that final plan and what that means in terms of creating revenue through customer bills. So effectively, where do you set the customer bills and generate income, which then gets invested into the improvements that you want to make? And that's the way that the system has worked for decades since we were privatized. In recent years, though, what has happened is that's still the kind of core way we operate, but performance commitments have now come in to that. So as well as generating income through delivering the service, there are certain metrics which are agreed upon, most of them common metrics between all of the companies, some bespoke metrics depending on if a company has got kind of specific issues in that are unique to its geography. And those are the ones where there's a pain and gain share on it. So if we think about many of the things that are on the top of customers' minds about how much water is lost through leakage in pipes, the pollutions that may occur, or water quality issues, those have now become performance commitments. And so if you meet your regulatory target, well, that's well and good, and you don't get anything either way. If you outperform on that, there is an opportunity to gain additional revenue and income. If you underperform, then there's a real opportunity to lose income, which will come off the next 5-year regulatory cycle. So, we have always focused on environmental and social outcomes as a business, but having that new performance commitment system has helped to really focus how you internalize that and how everybody in the company understands how they connect to that. The kind of build on that in recent years is actually then flowing that right the way through to senior, company employee bonuses, so that you put those performance commitments and our delivery against those into the bonus contracts for senior executives. And you either get your bonus for outperforming, or you don't get your bonus if we don't perform as a company. And that locks you in, if you weren't already locked in, to kind of own that purpose, whether it's a social or environmental outcome. And I would say, actually, as a company, we changed our Articles of Association 2 or 3 years ago to lock in our purpose, so that we are there. The purpose of the company is now to deliver environmental and social prosperity, as well as a fair return to our shareholders. So we've kind of hardwired that in. So there's still work to be done on that, because that's kind of pay for success elements. How you push that into really open, genuine outcomes is another opportunity that we can work on. And we've seen some of that. And Louise, coming back to one of the slides you put up there about, success is about driving it beyond the contract duration and beyond the contract scope. If we think about, the way we have been regulated in the past, to say, okay, if you're thinking about the environmental quality of the water coming out of what we would call a water recycling centre, but you would probably recognise the term sewage works. But we delivered, and this was a behavioural change thing. We changed the name of an entire department in the company to talk about water recycling, to drive home the fact that that is not, a lost resource. You're putting that back into the environment to be used again. Really, really important change that we made. So you can drive the improvement of the quality of that by putting in additional resources. You can build additional kit. You can put chemicals into it. You can put energy into it, and that will improve the quality of that environmental kind of outcome. Or you can say, right, let's build a nature-based solution, and let's work with a nature-based charity and the farming community and build a wetland next to the site. Now, that requires a change in regulation and a pushing of the boundaries of regulation, because you're not necessarily testing the quality as it comes out of the end of the pipe of the water recycling centre. You're actually testing the quality of the water as it comes out of the landscape and back into the river. Now, we did that successfully with all the regulators. And we've now seen that approved and developed from one site. We're now building another 26. So that's gone beyond the duration. And others are now picking that up through the regulatory process right across the UK, so outside of scope. So some similarities, some real similarities there. And so that's the pay for success. Then, of course, there's all these other things. So I was here last year talking about our place-based work, the work we've done with Ian and with business in the community, and picking up the point about educational kind of the raising of attainment and, aspiration. There's a huge amount of work that we and other companies have done working in local environments to deliver that. We're not paid for that, but it's really important for us in delivering both a social outcome, but also feeding a talent pipeline that we may benefit from in the future. The opportunities, again, there are about how do we work more effectively together, not only kind of business to business. And I recently hosted a conference where we brought 42 schools together with about 5 or 6 companies who are all doing elements of educational outreach. And I have an education team of 4 teachers, and we see about 32,000 students a year, kind of, because they say if you have 4 interventions with a single student during their educational life, you will increase their attainment and you also boost their aspiration. But how do we connect that to potentially social outcome bonds and to government aspirations in the future to make it more effective? Because in times that we're seeing at the moment, I am seeing businesses lose their educational outreach functions because it's not core to what they do. We haven't done that, and we're not going to do that because we see it as an opportunity to deliver, a behavioural change message into future customers, but also an opportunity to bring talented people into the business. So what I see, looking from the outside in, is just a huge opportunity to work more effectively together and to bring the private sector, and particularly spearheaded by the purposeful private sector, to drive that change in the long term.
Andy, we're about 2/3 into our discussion, so I'd like to pause at this moment and see if there are any comments, reactions, questions from the audience. I see Richard furiously waving his hand. Take it away, Richard.
I just wondered if it was worth Tom clarifying what you mean by results-based financing in a World Bank context, because it's very different to the sort of individual outcomes that everybody generally talks about here when they're talking about outcomes contracting or impact bonds.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so when I talk about results-based financing in the context of World Bank lending, it's loans that go to central government. I then may be implemented by central government or maybe passed on to local governments. But the conditions for disbursement are not just that they are spent, but that a set of quote-unquote results, which can be policy or institutional actions, they can be the behavioral consequences of those actions, or they may, in some circumstances, be things that you would recognize as an outcome, an improvement in learning outcomes or in health delivery or whatever. Typically, though, they tend to be things that are within the control of the government, because not many governments are willing to take disbursement risk on things that may be beyond their control. And they also, this particular instrument, use the country's own fiduciary financial management, procurement, and environmental and social risk management systems. So as I said before, it's possible to have other instruments that you could do results-based financing, but impose a set of risk management systems on the government as well. Does that make it clearer? Yeah.
Thanks for that. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Great session and great panelists. My question is the following. I'm from Colleges and Institutes Canada, so from Canada. So I would like to know, how do we create, as Ben mentioned, mindset change, or as Avnish mentioned, create a community such as this one that's exciting and dynamic around social impact bonds in countries where the mechanism, the model isn't used on such a widespread level. For example, in comparison in the UK, where according to your great GoLab's tool model, there are 89 impact bonds, and in comparison to only 5 impact bonds in Canada. So how do you create that momentum? How do you make it stick, feed and build a SIB ecosystem in those countries? Thank you.
Great question. Thanks for that. Ben, I feel like this one would be a good one for you, and perhaps then Avnish, if you want to add after that, but over to you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I think about this sometimes, and you need to have a leader in the space. And I don't think that always needs to be a political leader. I think it can be a community leader or a philanthropic leader. But I think sometimes of these interventions as, you're serving to a child and you put out a plate of carrots and healthy vegetables and you put out a plate of donuts and then you let them choose. Clearly, most children are going to go for the empty calories, the easy thing there. And I worry sometimes that we do that in the space of social outcomes, that we incentivize providers who I think have the best of intentions, but clearly they're going to go for the easy financial support. And it's hard to do systems change. It's hard to create a data system where you don't have it. It's hard to justify to, we always talk about limiting the amount of dollars that are spent on overhead and rather going directly into service delivery. But creating a data system is overhead. Tracking outcomes is overhead. And at some point we need leaders somewhere in this ecosystem who are willing to insist that adhering to outcomes, adhering to best practices, creating the elements within the system that are going to enable you to do that is important and it matters. And either they're going to step forward and pay for it, as I did when I was mayor, or they're not going to pay for something that isn't adhering to evidence-based practices and highest standards. So, I used to say when I was mayor all the time that, anytime we invest in a program that promises to help somebody and doesn't, and we could have invested in one that does, it's not only the waste of tax dollars that's important, but it's the promises that we made to a human life and failed to deliver on that. So we need to recognize that it is virtuous and right to insist on following evidence-based practices, on system reform, on changing the way things are done to make them data-driven, evidence-based, and outcome-focused. And you need someone in the system who's willing to plant a flag to say this is the way we need to go, and this is how it's going to happen. And once you do that, I think back to the oil tanker and the tugboat, you start to move a system. And as a system starts to move, as we've seen in my government experience, once that system starts to move, people start realizing that data is where, we are departing from the days when a wonderful dinner with some touching stories is what's going to raise money to fund an organization, and data is what's going to get an organization funded. What's going to get a social an intervention funded is bringing forward good data and evidence-based practices. You start to steer the ship in that direction, and people realize that that's where the calories, so to speak, are going to come from, is by adhering to evidence-based practices, and you can start to move the ecosystem in that direction.
Thank you, Ben. Avnish, do you want to add?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really kind of, sort of goes to the heart of sort of how do you scale those practices, right? When you think about sort of each of these projects, the enabler for them and for these practices to change is often this kind of civil servant champion or political champion, right? And if you really want to scale, you need many, many more of those in government, right? And actually they do exist, but we often sort of disregard them, or we don't know who they are, or they're dormant, and we haven't activated or find a way to activate that energy, right? But in our own experience, I think this is an important stakeholder group to invest in. So how do you go from having 5 champions in Canada to like having hundreds of champions who are familiar with this? Sometimes familiarity is not even there and people are not aware that these practices exist. Sometimes people in government are extremely disempowered and isolated, especially those who tend to be entrepreneurial. So how do you support them in that process of starting a change journey? Sometimes you need to support them with certain professional skills, because they may have great ideas, but they may not know how to communicate them. Or they may have incredible ideas, but they don't know how to manage change within a politically complex environment. So I think investing in communities of practice has huge dividends. But oftentimes we don't invest ahead of time. We go in a very transactional way. When we have a project, we try to get it done, and then it's too late. So I think that's a great tactic that has worked in places like Colombia, and I think also in other places in the UK and elsewhere could be replicated. Once you have this community of champion, I think we need to do everything we can to make it easy for them to get to action. Sometimes we often observe that governments don't have budget line items for innovative finance. That just doesn't exist. So if their job is already, they have a full stack of stuff to do. If they're innovative, they've added more stuff to their plate, they're extremely overwhelmed. They're not going to be able to go and find resources on demand. So if we can make that available, on-demand resources, I think has been extremely powerful. And I think if you look at the ecosystems, the UK, the US, Colombia, the availability of on-demand resources leads to incredible demand from government that beyond your imagination. So I think that's a great tactic that has worked. And then beyond, reducing the costs, I think we also need to increase the benefits of doing it. So what's been really powerful is when you have this early demonstration, being able to really elevate them and make them politically attractive for others to follow. It really de-risks the innovation process. It makes others be more comfortable that someone else in government has done it. So I'm not gonna, get in trouble for trying something different and new. And all of this, speaks to the fact that we are really talking about an emotional journey, not just a technical journey, not just, something that's, quite process oriented, which it can appear to be. But it's, and I think that's an important framing. This is really change management. We're dealing with people sort of taking risks and going for difficult transitions in terms of learning new skills, we're asking a system to rewire itself and reorganize itself, and that's a very complicated process. So these champions need to be truly identified, curated, empowered, and if we manage to find a way to really, really expand this community, I think we're going to have pathways to scale it out different from the ones we have today.
I was just going to say, I'd love to come to you, Tom, and then I'll go to Louise. Tom, with you.
Thanks. I want to pick up on this point about ambition that Ben raised. Getting the targets at the right level is critical for results-based financing, probably outcome-based contracting as well, to work. You want to get them at a level which is quote unquote challenging, but achievable, right? Trouble is that no one actually knows what that is. I was having a conversation yesterday with our colleagues from the National Lottery Fund. They were saying that a lot of the SIBs they're involved with had failed because the targets were set at an overly ambitious level, and you know, they ran into the sand. I've actually had the opposite problem. I see operations in which the incentive is on both sides to set them at too low a level, to keep money flowing, and in order to be able to claim success. I suspect that what is going on is that there is there's a cycle of understanding about what target setting means for all those involved. If you don't understand what the risks are, if you don't understand that you're going to be liable if you don't meet a target, then you're probably not going to be able to, you're not going to pay much attention to the level at which it's set. And you may well set it high in a bid to capture attention or get upfront credit. Once you begin to realize what the consequences of not meeting that target are, you go in the opposite direction and you become very risk averse. And so one of the things that we have to do is make sure that everyone in the service delivery chain understands what their responsibilities are, understands what the consequences of not meeting a target are, and then we work to identify what some trend level of improvement is and set targets at the upper bound of that trend line. Thanks.
Louise, you wanted to chip in?
Sure. I just, in the absence of having UK government colleagues on the panel, I just wanted to kind of present, a slightly UK perspective to your question, which is that I think it requires a lot of different people in a lot of different parts of the system to really create momentum behind any social change effort, not just social outcomes contracts. And so if I look at how this market has evolved in the UK, I look at, there was definitely leadership from the top in the early days, cabinet office ministers, senior stakeholders outside government, so Ronald Cohen really pushing for this, inserting it into the UK's G7 presidency agenda, social investment as a headline thing that the UK wanted to push. And then from that, I think thinking in a very comprehensive way about all the different actors that would need to be engaged in order to make a market work. Thinking about, how could government be supported to do this through both a centre for SIBs that sits within central government and outcomes funds that maybe match fund with local authorities to use these structures. Looking at charity law for philanthropies around how they can use their endowment assets to invest in line with their mission. Looking at tax breaks, social investment tax relief for investors to bring them into the party, to bring them to the table. And I think, and also, seeding places exactly like the GoLab, right? In fact, the GoLab, an entity that is independent, is not acting in the market, and yet can convene, can share data, can share knowledge, can bring together this amazing community of practice. And so I think it's really, there's no simple answer to it, but I think, you have to look at it from all those different angles. And I think, Andrew, your example of business and how business plays into this is also really important, right? These are big, we are collectively facing really big challenges that are much bigger than the capacity of government or any given actor within an ecosystem to solve. And we have to find ways to come together as a cross-sector partnerships to solve and address those issues.
Thanks, Louise. I think there's another question from the audience. Nigel, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Can everyone hear me? I don't have a hand up. Yeah, okay. Oh, I do have a hand up. Amazing. Yeah. So, well, first, thanks, Louise, for recognizing the value of something like the GoLab. Let's have more GoLab. Obviously, we're entering into some of these international collaborations now with our data initiative, Indigo, including with Inspire in Brazil. So that's starting to happen, which is exciting. I actually wanted to pick on Thomas's point. I think what's been interesting for me in this iteration of the social outcomes contract is that I think the conversation is starting to move beyond, what's the right target to set at the start of a contract. In some ways, that's always going to be impossible. It's just not possible to predict how successful the contract is going to be. The circumstances will change. You just can't know. There's radical uncertainty. These are complex populations. We just can't really predict what's going to happen. So, that leads you in two directions. One is, are the outcomes really performing the function of proving the success of these contracts, or are they actually doing something quite different, which is acting as a kind of galvanizing goal for the partners to come around? And we discussed that this morning in a session that I was chairing on measurement. And then the other aspect of it is, are these contracts really more about something relational, which allows the partners to adapt as they go along to those changing circumstances, and so actually, it's more about what behaviors the contract is unlocking, rather than the sort of accountability burden of prove that this worked. And that's something that we also discussed in a session earlier on relational contracting. So I just wanted to bring those in because that's been discussed quite a lot at the conference. I don't know, we've all had different journeys through the conference, but I think that those are interesting elements that I think speak to this point of will we ever be able to set the targets at the right level? We're always going to be either over or under ambitious if we think that that's what it's about. But if we treat the targets as something to be negotiated as we go through, and we, rather than seeing that as moving the goalpost, we see that as potentially a good thing because it's unlocking positive behaviors. That's perhaps something that we should be a bit more thoughtful about in our practice.
Thank you, Nigel. Does anyone want to respond to that? Yeah, Carolyn, go ahead.
One thing to keep in mind is that, I still remember when back closer to 2011, 12, 13, when we first started talking more about social impact bonds people were talking about this completely changing the way we do the business of government, right? Is this going to supplant what government has traditionally done with these new arrangements? But I think one of the interesting things is I think we've come to learn through your work here at the GoLab and through a lot of experimentation that there is no one model, right? And yours is what you've just described is kind of think where we're evolving, right? The fact that realizing that these have been constant tensions, whether they're in a SIB or not, right? The challenge of having good data to understand trends, what's going to disrupt those trends that we need to account for. And one of the interesting things I think from not just funding SIBs, but funding feasibility studies. So some countries and some institutions have funded feasibility studies. In the US, that's what we put federal legislation and money into our federal agencies to require them to experiment with what we call pay for success, similar to social impact bonds. And one of the things we studied who applied, who was awarded feasibility money, and then what the experience of those who both got those feasibility contracts were and those who didn't. And interestingly, they're of course in awarding those feasibility studies, they looked at what are the kind of the preconditions for successful, pay for success or SIB project to emerge. And so you look at, strong collaborations. We're talking about, ability to build capacity, having data that you experience doing this. And it was very interesting finding was that those who, and we asked them how optimistic they were about the success before and then after they went through the feasibility process. And those who were most knowledgeable, most prepared capacity-wise, rated themselves the lowest chance of success in actually implementing the social event than those who were just, okay, this is another chance for us to have money to do what we want to do, and we're going to figure this out. At the same time, one of the things we learned from the feasibility studies was that even if they didn't progress to social impact bond, they laid groundwork for one of the things that Ben was talking about, starting to have a common mindset about whether it's goals, the awareness of what data could do for them. And so I do think that, the process of going through, even figuring out whether it's feasible, and then, if maybe a social impact fund never could be feasible in this particular context, but we've realized those are the capacities we were talking about here, right? That could be built for us to do better what we've been trying to do or to achieve the goals of a project.
I think Ben had his hands up. I lost him from the screen.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly you're never going to take politics out of politics. And so to the extent that the comment was made that is this nothing more than just rallying people behind something, I'll be the first to admit I'm a Democrat in a very conservative state in Utah. So I knew that the message about helping people probably wasn't going to be my strongest message. So I had to talk about saving money, right? And so that is certainly part of it. But I think there is something bigger at work when we saw what else happened with the creation of the data system, the adherence to evidence-based practices. And for me, it comes back to also something bigger at work, and it is allocating the liability of non-performance to the party who is best suited to minimize the liability. So traditional government programs will have the liability of non-performance on government. So I fund a program, it doesn't work, my money was wasted, right? And my effort, when I say mine, I mean the taxpayers' dollars and my dollars as mayor. And government is, I will say, not best suited to avoid that adverse outcome. Government is where we're structured is we're going to look at this in a budgeting cycle. So it might be a year, it might be an election cycle, it might be 4 years before we go and look at a program. And it might be never, because I actually, as an elected official, have every incentive to never discover if a program isn't working because it might make me look bad. So, we're going to have all these incentives to not change anything, to not identify programs that aren't working. But through a pay for success or social impact bond framework, what we've done is we've shifted the liability of non-performance onto the provider. And I think you could have similar challenges as a grant maker or philanthropy if you are assuming the risk of non-performance. So you put the risk of non-performance on the provider. That provider, as in our case with COVID, saw within days that the program wasn't working, and they knew they were at risk if they didn't find a way to fix it. And so they rallied, they brought government to the table, they brought funders to the table, and they brought other providers to the table. They were best situated to avoid it. So there's a principle in the law called it's the Coase theorem, or the least cost avoider, where you allocate the liability of an outcome, of an adverse outcome, onto the entity that is best situated with the lowest effort and has the right levers to avoid an outcome, a negative outcome. And I think that's what another thing that Pay for Success does is it puts the responsibility to ensure an outcome onto the entity that is best situated to make sure it happens.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I want to push back very strongly on this idea that we downplay penalties for non-performance. I'm fully on board with the idea of balancing flexibility and discipline. I'm on board with the idea of using failure to achieve a target as an entry point for a conversation about what went wrong, and the idea that that may well lead us to uncover things that we hadn't suspected about the generation of outcomes, or the existence of shocks or factors that were beyond the control of the implementing agency that might not have been anticipated. That's fine. But when you have similar agents in like position, one of whom is doing much better than the other, and you don't penalize, or you remove the threat of penalty for the poorer performer, I think you're undercutting the rationale for doing this.
Hung, did you want to jump in on this point? Or different?
It's not a provocation question. So it's about, I think, this interaction between projects and system. We've talked a lot about needing evidence, data, but I think there's a risk that we think of it just purely as a rational, logical model, where we think we have to have the evidence changes awareness raises knowledge triggers behavior change. And that does happen sometime. I'm not against evidence, especially in these hallowed halls. I'm all for evidence, but I always think it's evidence plus. And what the plus looks like depends on context. So in Russia, when they released a policy to do SIPs, no one moved. until there's a presidential decree saying you will all do SIPs, and then they all moved. In New South Wales and Australia, state government says we will bring out 2 SIPs every year. Then everyone started doing that. The ecosystem changed. Andy, you talked about regulation. Sometimes regulation and legislation can get things moving, even when the awareness and knowledge isn't there. So I think you need to look at the barriers and opportunities in each ecosystem and just be pragmatic about what's required to get it to move.
I want to respond to Chikung's provocation.
I fully agree. And I think a thread that has been going discussion as well is just the presence of huge disincentives for the rational actor of the system. The average person, the non-sort of unique champion kind of Mayor McAdams profile, right? He's more of an exception than the rule, right? So there's this kind of like huge need to figure out how do we sort of counteract the disincentive that's actually built in, which is why we exist, which is why this whole ecosystem pushes so hard, right? And I think we talked a lot today about the push strategies, right? How do you go out? How do you get more champions? But I think we also need to talk about the pull strategies, right? Is our strategy really going to be to centrally plan the solving of government? We have rejected this concept in our private lives and private markets like a long time ago. And I don't think we're going to be successful if our whole theories are we're going to go to every corner of government and solve every contracting challenge all the way down to the bottom, right? So what is the invisible hand of performance that drives government systems to perform in different ways, in better ways? And there's an opportunity, I think, to seek partnerships with the accountability space and the transparency space, which is perhaps a bit beyond the scope of what folks in this room directly work on. But I think that's a hugely powerful complementary space. And ultimately, we exist to solve an accountability failure, right? So if there was incredible accountability to the front lines of service delivery, citizens had power to choose public providers that they go to, this kind of idyllic vision, then a lot of what we would do would be very much driven by some sort of, okay, what's the right way to set metrics? There's technical considerations, and we wouldn't have this change management process, right? So I think looking for opportunities, especially with new technology that allows us to engage citizens way easier, cheaper, at scale, and get feedback much more easily, I think could be a good strategy too.
Great, thanks for that. I've been keeping an eye on the chat. I'd love to perhaps go to Ian and just explore a bit more this point about the internal champions. And I see a couple of other hands here on this screen, but I think, Bridget, you've already asked your question, unless there was an additional question. No. Ian, do you want to add your comments? I know you've posted in the chat, but do you want to say anything else live to our audience?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. I thought Avnish's comments about essentially about internal champions within government was really useful. But the reality on the ground is that people, especially people who within government who are a bit more innovative and entrepreneurial in their thinking, tend to move around quite quickly. They tend to be in one post for a relatively short period of time. So you build up a relationship, and they become an internal champion around a specific policy issue. And then they move off to some other policy, and the whole process starts again, rebuilding that internal champion. And that has the upside that if you do it for long enough, you have potential internal champions in a number of different policy areas, but it does slow down the process. And people are instinctively often wary of change. I'm old enough to remember when you had to go to the bank to get cash and you couldn't get it from a machine in the wall. And there was a machine, one of the first machines that came in, I used to use. Then they placed a second machine beside the first one, identical machines. And this was always a cameo for me of changing. I was about to go across the road to get money from the machine, and there were a queue of people at the old machine, not a soul at the new machine, because the new machine was new. And it might not work the same way, and it might burn me, and it might not give me money. And people are instinctively cautious of change, and in an environment which is often risk averse in any event in government, to find those internal champions who are there long enough to make change is challenging, but it can have its advantages too, because you can have them in a number of places over a number of years. So it was really just to comment on that and to thank Avnish for that insight.
Thank you. And thank you everyone who's been dropping their thoughts in the chat. We're now 5 minutes away from the end of the session. I saw a hand up at the back. Is it going to be a quick one? Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Thoughts. One was seeing the possibilities and one was leadership. But I would like to bring in the question of these shadow processes that now we are currently discussing, as I understand, about countries where we have existing SIP culture. I'm coming from Finland, where currently these coordinating actors or leaders have vanished. So there's nobody to coordinate. And also I think that how to take this thinking to countries where SIPs don't exist. I think that's highly essential for all of us, that there's a risk that otherwise it's only the same countries continue to play the same game. Yeah.
Thank you. Any final remarks from our panelists? Yes, go ahead, Tom.
I think this is a very interesting point. There have been a number of conversations over these 2 days about the circumstances in which it's possible to sustain long-term engagement, whether it's around regional development, local service delivery, or whatever. And what seems to be emerging is the idea that this works best when you've got a vertically layered oversight. That is, from local governments to meso-level organizations to national government, and then in some cases to supranational government. And there was an example of the EIB backstopping arrangements for healthcare reform in northern Italy. The EU has done this through structural funds. That's exactly the role that an organization like the World Bank plays with respect to ministries of finance. And you see a cascading of these accountability relationships, right? Down a service delivery chain, from us to Ministry of Finance, from Ministry of Finance to line agencies, from line agencies to service providers. And so I think that sort of backstopping and layered oversight is probably what you want to be trying to create.
Thanks, Tom. Andy, you wanted to add? Yeah,
I just wanted to add in a thought on there in terms of champions and advocates outside the norm of social outcomes. Again, it's kind of also answering your point from a Canadian point of view. You know, there may well be advocates or actors in the business community or in the investment community that have a connection. So one of our major shareholders, investors, is the Canadian state pension, you know, deeply involved in the work that we do from a kind of social and environmental outcome point of view. So, you know, try and find those additional connections. You know, one of our investors may have investments in Finland, I'm not sure, but, you know, it's kind of reaching out beyond the current community, because there are a lot of people interested in this social and environmental outcome space. And you're just kind of picking up one of the other points about the kind of rate of change and metrics, and, you know, having to record these things. You know, 3 years ago, yes, we were reporting on environmental and social outcomes because we wanted to. Now I spend half my time delivering environmental social governance reporting to the investment community, because that's what's required. So, you know, that change can happen incredibly quickly.
Thanks for that. Caroline, I know you wanted to chip in, but first I just wanted to check, Ben, before we say goodbye, is there anything else you'd like to add to this discussion?
No, I think to the point that we're not going to master plan all of the solutions in government, but I think what we can do is set, whether you're in government or philanthropy or a service provider, set a framework so that the incentives are aligned and so people will rally together to solve these problems. We need to set a new baseline and an expectation that every dollar, and this is what I did when I was mayor. We didn't disrupt existing. We were focused on every new dollar that's spent on new programming will be data driven, evidence focused, and outcome driven. And we just need to start moving that ship, moving that oil tanker in the direction and setting a framework that these problems are expected to be solved.
Thanks for that. Caroline?
I was going to say the pure SIB is just one model. There is no one model that's going to work everywhere. And the exciting thing is let's see what we evolve to in the future and what we learn from all this rich collection of information as we study and dig in and figure out what works around the world.
That's a great message. Avnish, was there anything else you wanted to add? Otherwise, I'll go to Louise. You've developed this conceptual framework. Caroline's just articulated the need to take some of these conversations forward. How do we do that?
So I think there's just 2 points I will pick up right at the end. One is I completely agree. I think there's real potential for the drivers of impact, what we know drives impact and resilience within these contracts, to be applied much more broadly than just within social outcomes contracts. And I think, Ji-Hong, your point that you work with the grain, you look for opportunities, be they policy, funding, champions, and you work with that and you build on success, I think is going to be ultimately how we achieve that change. So I guess that would be my first observation. My second is really a call to the academics in the room and the evaluators, which is, what we presented here today is a conceptual framework. It's grounded in anecdotal evidence, but it needs to be researched. Please go and research it. Please come back next year or in 2 years' time and tell us whether and how and under what circumstances these kinds of contracts can have this ripple effect beyond the term and beyond the scope to create lasting change.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, wonderful panelists, wonderful participants, and what a great message to end the conference on, a call for action, both for practitioners, both for researchers. Huge thanks, everyone. This is, thank you. Before we say goodbye, because the fun never stops at the Social Outcome Conference. So this is obviously the last formal session of our program, but we do have an absolutely fantastic public talk in about half an hour, and we'll be joined by our director, Mara Roldi, and Stefan Durkin. So I know some of you have trains to catch, planes and so on, but still stick around.
And just before you all go, there's a few thanks that are needed. So, and we want to take this opportunity just now to do that. So, first of all, thanks to the School of Government and all the teams here for all of their help behind the scenes. You probably haven't noticed, but the catering team, the AV team have been brilliant. The facilities team have helped us to make sure this conference runs smoothly. So first of all, thank you to them. Second of all, to the entire GoLab team, all 22 of us, or all 21 of you, because I probably shouldn't include myself in this, but you've been absolutely brilliant, and the whole team puts a huge amount of effort into making the Social Outcomes Conference work, and it takes a phenomenal amount of preparation. And as you can see, everyone's been very closely involved to make sure the whole thing goes really smoothly. So a massive thank you, GoLab team. You're amazing. Well done. But there are two members of the team who deserve particular thanks, because without them, none of this would have worked. And those are Andrea herself and Ellie. So thank you both very, very much. So these are the being gender neutral, the king and queen of the Social Outcomes Conference. I'll let you decide which one's which. Yeah, Andrea and Ellie really have been outstanding. Andrea, plans everything down to the minutest detail, and it's Ellie who has been working furiously behind the scenes, answering all of your emails, and really making sure that all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. So thank you both very much, and and thanks to all of you for coming, and everyone who's joined us online, and see you next year, if not before.
And for next year,
we have the date.
We do. If we go on to the next slide. So next year we're hoping to host you all again in Oxford on the 14th and 15th of September. Hope you enjoyed it this year, and then you'll be back next year. And huge thanks, everyone, and absolutely special thanks to Ellie. She's been such a superstar. Really, thank you, Ellie.